Before the hyper-polished deathcore of today, deathcore was in an era of raw, unapologetic violence. Today I want to talk about the first years of one of the biggest names in the genre, Thy Art Is Murder. Now, I'm not talking about the album you're probably thinking of, not 2012's Hate that helped define the sound of modern deathcore. I'm thinking about way before they sold out arenas. We're going back to their foundation, the EP Infinite Death. Infinite Death unapologetically opens with a pingy drum fill before immediately launching into relentless blast beats. From there, Brendan Van Ryn wastes no time establishing the EP's lyrical identity. Unapologetically confrontational, immature violence. Every track is filled up with huge breakdowns, technical sweeping, and obvious suicide silence worship, but the musicianship is strong enough that the riffs still hold up nearly 2 decades later. Of course, it's impossible to talk about Infinite Death without addressing his lyrics. Beyond the expected violence, much of the EP revolves around misogyny to a degree that many listeners understandably find difficult to stomach. The controversy surrounding the lyrics has followed the release ever since. The bands largely distanced themselves from the material after Brendan's departure, and eventually refused to perform any songs from that EP live. And later they released a track on their 2019 album titled Atonement, which actually in part was a response to the guilt associated with the lyrical content of this era from over 10 years prior, from a different vocalist. Now, after listening to this EP so many times, I started to notice buried among all the hyper-violent imagery are moments where the narrator actually briefly drops the invincible persona. Lines like my life feels half complete, I am fucking pathetic, have I lost my mind for becoming who I am? Whether intentional or not, they create the impression of someone who constantly projects power while privately falling apart and just despises themselves at the end of the day. I'm not saying that this is the intended meaning of the EP. Primary goal obviously was just to simply write the most offensive deathcore record possible in 2008. However, reading it in the way of projecting self-hatred outward, the misogyny becomes less of a triumphant worldview and more of a symptom of a deeply broken person. Now, whether Brendan consciously included this is impossible to know, but it's an interesting lens to revisit the EP with. Ultimately, though, Infinite Death is remembered for its guitar work, breakdowns, and sheer energy, which explain why this EP became such a landmark release in early deathcore.